to do this online session with us, which is wonderful. So basically, just to say very quickly that he's from the Conversation Africa, a distinguished South African journalist, communication specialist, and editor whose career spans over 2 decades, working across media, government, and finance. So you did work for the Reserve Bank, didn't you, at some point, Jabulani?
Yes, yeah, I did. Yeah, I did.
Which I think is super interesting and kind of really gives you an in-depth understanding in terms of the way that finances work in South Africa. So without further ado, I want to actually hand over to Jabulani so that he can take us through this very important topic today, which is about employment and unemployment, and particularly how StatsSA measures these very important statistics. And Jabulani will handle all the questions and everything as well. It will be a very interactive section. So Jabulani, over to you. And thank you very, very much for being here. And thank you to all of you for being here too. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Good morning, colleagues. Thanks for the opportunity. I hope we can try and make this as interactive as possible. Questions that you ask are always I always find them very useful. Just for myself, I actually learn quite a lot, or have learned quite a lot from sort of the interactions and the questions that people ask or have asked during previous sort of discussions of this nature. So we're going to talk about how StatsSA measures unemployment and employment, because the two go hand in hand. It's almost like the inner part of your hand and the outer part, or maybe to use another analogy, it's the left and the right hand, so they go hand in hand. So in terms of framing the issue of how the statistical agency goes about measuring employment and unemployment, there are quite a number of issues that are important in the framing, I think, of the discussion. One is legislation. There's legislation that talks to who is a child, right? So anyone below the age of 15 can't be employed legally, because that will be regarded as child labor, and I'll come to why that is important. Then at the upper end is the retirement age. Obviously, employers also have their own retirement policies. Like some of you might have seen in the news last week, that Standard Bank has increased the retirement age for its top management from 60 to 63, right? However, in terms of legislation, the retirement age is 65. And that has a bearing also on how StatsSA goes about measuring employment and unemployment. The other issue is VAT registration, or registration for VAT. So if you register for some category of employers or businesses, people register for VAT purposes with SARS. That comes into the measurement of employment and unemployment when StatsSA goes about its task there. The other factor on employment and unemployment is obviously education levels. We'll come to it, and skills, sort of as one pair. We will get to how those two factors sort of affect employment and unemployment opportunities. Then there are two broad, or two categories, or two ways in which StatsSA measures employment and unemployment. One is StatsSA does two types of surveys. One is a survey of employers, and I think there's about 20,000 employers that StatsSA will talk to or will ask periodically whether they've hired or kind of laid off people in a particular quarter, because all of these numbers relating to employment and unemployment are measured on a quarterly basis. So there's a survey for employers, then there's a survey for households. That's a term used in statistics. A household is a very simple thing, basically. It's just a group of people who live together and share or contribute or provide for themselves for their living expenses, whether it's food and other kind of essentials. So, but also a person who lives on their own and are looking after themselves, in other words, financially, they constitute what StatsSA would regard as a household. So in terms of the last data from StatsSA, there are almost just under 19 million households in South Africa. Remember, that's different to the population. Population of the country is 62 million, or just over 62 million, maybe it will be 63 now. And then the number of households is around 19 million. So if you kind of average that, it will just give you a number roughly of, on average, how many people constitute kind of a household. But that will be at an average level, because there are people who live alone. There are people who, well, there are households where you'll find 2 people, 3 people, so it varies. But if you just take 63 million and divide by 19 million, you will get an average number for an average household size in the country. So that being the, any questions on that kind of framing of the discussion? Yep. Right. So as I said, then SARS, no, not SARS, StatsSA does 2 surveys. One is called the Quarterly Employment Survey, which is that survey of employers, the 20,000 sort of employers. And then the other one for households is called the Quarterly Labor Force Survey. Basically, it's the individuals that and there are about 30,000 households that StatsSA talks to on a quarterly basis to collect data on what it calls their labor market activities. Coming back to the issue of the legislation, which is first framing who is a child and who is in retirement or who is about to go into retirement, then that helps give you, out of the total population, the number of people that are regarded as people who can work. And then therefore those people between the ages of 15 and 64 are kind of, they form the pool from which the country's labor force, as StatsSA will kind of describe it, will be drawn, right? But still, out of that pool, aged 15 and 64, there are categories of people that then get excluded. Obviously, I mean, there are people who are still at school. If you're 15, you haven't really, you may still be going through the latter part of your high school, so you haven't completed school. But as you know, which is quite prevalent in sort of Black communities, people do drop out before they complete high school and then start looking for a job, right? But the category of people that gets excluded are those that are still kind of going through their high school. Then there are those, obviously, when they complete high school and then they go on to university or go to a TVET college for kind of training to get some skills. So that category will be taken out of that number. Then there would be people who would, well, obviously, I mean, once you reach 64 and above, you are deemed to be close to retirement or just about to retire, or even though people do retire earlier than that these days, but 64 is still the cutoff point, because when you hit 65, you reach retirement age. But you must bear in mind that the way things are going, not only in South Africa, but globally, people continue working way beyond 65. So even if somebody may retire formally from an employer, they may continue, or actually some people do continue, either doing contract work or doing other things, I mean, that kind of generate income from them post sort of the retirement age of 65. So once you've narrowed the number, and then you get the number then of people. Once you have excluded those that are still at school, those that have gone on to university, those that have gone on to TVET colleges, and those obviously who kind of have retired or are about to retire, and then you have then a much narrower relatively pool of people then that are your labor force, right? So the labor force now that I'm talking about, the reduced one, is basically then the total number then that gives you the number of people who are employed and the people who are unemployed, right? And any questions so far? Nope. Right. So now you then have a number of who's employed and who's excuse me, who is unemployed, right? So now coming back to the two types of surveys, each has its own limitations and can potentially generate its own kind of type of problems, but we will come to those just now, right? So the household survey, in other words, the survey of individuals, if to put it in more simplified terms, of the 30,000 kind of dwelling units, is a much broader survey in terms of its coverage, because it includes people who work as agricultural workers, the people who are self-employed, but whose businesses aren't registered, in other words, or as the terminology would go, whose businesses are not incorporated, right? People who are unpaid family workers, and there's quite a lot of that in most communities, and people who work as domestic workers, right, would be be included in the household survey, which then makes it much broader. The survey of employers obviously does not include excludes agricultural workers. Obviously, it doesn't cover self-employed workers who are, in other words, who run a business, but their business is not registered, right? Then it also does not include unpaid family workers. It also excludes domestic workers, or the terminology used is private household workers, but we're talking about domestic workers, really, which are people who kind of work inside the house, doing cleaning, cooking, washing, and that sort of thing, as well as people who do gardening. So those are excluded from the quarterly employment survey, which is a survey of employers. The other major difference is that the household survey is, in other words, as I said, it covers people between ages 15 and 64, whereas the survey of employers has got no age limit, really. It just deals with people that the employer kind of has on his or her books. Then as I said, the survey of employers obviously is based on VAT registration. So it only surveys those employers that are registered for VAT. And as some of you may be aware, if you want to register for VAT, there's a certain criteria that you have to meet. Obviously, you have to be incorporated as a business, have a corporate or a company registration number. You have to be registered for tax with SARS, and then you must have a certain level of turnover, I think, if I remember correctly. So there are those limitations that deal with registration for VAT. Now, once then you have that, let's maybe for now just stick with the household survey of employment, the 30,000 households that SARS will talk to on a quarterly basis to collate the statistics. It works on the basis of a reference week. By a reference week, what I mean is that if the StatsSA guys are interviewing somebody today, they will ask you what you did the previous week. So that's a reference week, right? Because this is a global thing. Statisticians who measure, or economists who measure employment or unemployment have made the point over the years that if you go beyond a week, the ability of most or some people to recall what they did 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks ago is could create some problems because people may forget some things, but most people will recall what they did the previous week. You know, what did you do last week? I mean, yes, I went out and looked for a job, or I did the following type of work-related activities, which is then makes that measurement more an activity-based measurement, which then determines whether you were employed or you were regarded as being unemployed, right? So you hence the terminology, the reference week. The reference week is a week before the day on which the StatsSA team interviews that person, or that person fills a form or a survey form that they're required to fill, right? So then to then measure whether you were employed or not, or you are employed or not, if you answer that in the reference week, which is the week before the interview, did you do any work for at least 1 hour, right? During that week, or had a job, or you run your own business. Remember, if you run your own business, but it's an unregistered business, you do qualify as being employed, right? So even if you were not at work last week, but if you have a job, you do run your own business, or you did at least 1 hour of work the previous week, then you will fall under the category of people who are regarded as being employed, right? Have I still got everybody kind of along with me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
Right.
Thanks, Jabu.
Yeah, and then the difference then, if you, now let me explain who is statistically is then regarded or is deemed unemployed, right? If in the previous week, the reference week that I spoke about, you were not employed, right? So in other words, you didn't work 1 hour, you didn't have a job, you're not running any business of your own, you will be deemed to be unemployed, right? And unemployment then comes in two kind of variations. There's what is called the official definition or the narrow definition of unemployment. And that's a number that gets quoted most often. So, for example, the official definition in terms of the official definition of unemployment in South Africa, we have just under 33%. It's 32 point something of the labor force is unemployed, right? The second definition is called the expanded definition. I'll explain the expanded definition shortly. So coming back to the unemployed, so to be part of the official definition of unemployment, so you were not employed in the reference week, but you were actively looking for work, or you were trying to start a business in the 4 weeks before the interview or before the survey, right? Thirdly, you were available for work. In other words, during the interview, one of the questions would be, well, are you available for work? So if you say you are available for work, but you haven't worked last week, but you were actively looking for work, or you were trying to start a business in the past 4 weeks, then you'll be deemed unemployed. But if in the past 4 weeks you had not been actively looking for work, but you had a job, in other words, or a business that you had concluded that it will start operating at a definite date in the future, then you would also, that would cancel the fact that you were not actively looking for work in the previous 4 weeks. So typically, I mean, that will cover somebody who maybe went to an interview. Let's say if you went to an interview in May, and then you receive a letter, say at the end of May, that you will start your new job 1st of July, right? And or even in August for that matter, and the StatsSA team is talking to you, let's say today, which is the end of June, or even if they were talking to you last week, right? So if in the first instance you had said that, no, but for the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks, I hadn't been actively looking for work, obviously they would note that down. But then when it comes to this last criteria, then they would ask you, do you have a job that's lined up, in other words, that's confirmed, and there's a date on which that job, you will start that job. Then if you say, yes, I've got a job that's starting either mid-July or in July or even in August for that matter, then they will then tick you as kind of meeting that criteria, right? Then coming to the expanded definition, right? So it's people who meet all of the criteria that I've listed for the unemployed, but over and above that, they have stopped looking for work. In other words, in the last week or in the past 4 weeks, they haven't been looking for work, right? So then those types of people are then deemed as discouraged work seekers, right? They get excluded, remember, from the narrow definition or from the official definition of unemployment. But if you do an expanded, if you're using an expanded definition of unemployment, and then they get added back, right? So the two important factors that determine who falls under the expanded definition of unemployment, you in other words, you are someone who qualifies and available for work, but you just have not been looking during the reference period, one. Secondly, you have other reasons for not searching. So other reasons could, it's a whole list of things. I mean, and they sometimes vary from one person to the next. Some people sometimes say, look, I've run out of money for kind of going or for traveling to go to where potential jobs are to look for work. I know in KZN, this used to be known as Ubuyo Fesa, which I don't know what's called in other indigenous languages, which basically means you go and kind of knock at factory gates, or kind of these days people go to shopping centers, visit kind of retail outlets to see if they have got any kind of job opportunities, and then sometimes drop off a CV, which is quite the most prevalent way of looking for a job, I think, for young people. So drop CVs all over the place. So if you run out of money and you're waiting either for a relative to give you some money at some point, or somebody has promised to give you some funds at some point in the future, you would then fall under that broad definition of unemployment, because you are not actively looking or have been actively looking for employment during that reference period. So then what was the other point? Then there are two other important issues that come into the picture, and they kind of gained quite a lot of currency in recent weeks. I'm sure some of you or most of you might have seen the debate in the media, which was triggered by the group chief executive of Capitec, when he accused StatsSA of under-recording employment or not measuring employment in the country accurately. And in his argument, he said actually the narrow definition of employment is as low as 10%, not 32.5 or 32.4, which is the number that's been coming from StatsSA. And his argument was that StatsSA is leaving out the informal sector, right? Which is not true, because in terms of the economic and statistical definition of the informal sector, it's all those kind of economic activities that people undertake, but without having a formally registered business. So somebody who sells tomatoes and other vegetables or fruits on the side of the road, they don't kind of go and register a business to do that sort of thing. They just doing it on their own. StatsSA does measure that. The real question is whether the 3 million or so kind of informal activities that StatsSA measures, is that does that leave a huge number out, or is that an accurate sort of measurement? So StatsSA does both in calculating economic activity as measured by GDP, but for the purposes of today, also in terms of measuring employment and unemployment, it does include the informal sector. As I say, I mean, it's about 3 million or so of people that are in the informal sector, right? And the definition used by StatsSA of what constitutes an informal sector, in other words, is people who are working in establishment that employ fewer than 5 people, where there's no deduction of income tax from the salaries or wages of those people, right? As you would know from your entities that you either run or work for, every employer, if they are a formal business, they deduct monthly what is known as pay as you earn, which then from each salary of an employee, and then pay that over to SARS on a monthly basis, right? So informal sector, According to StatsSA, it's a business that employs fewer than 5 people, and then where the employer does not deduct the pay-as-you-earn that I've referred to. Then also the informal sector, in terms of the StatsSA definition, are employers or people who work for their own businesses. So in other words, you're running your own kind of businesses, and people who kind of provide kind of unpaid services, in other words, for that business, who are also not registered for either income tax or VAT, the value-added tax. So that's the definition that StatsSA uses for the informal sector. So that will be included. If it comes up in the, when StatsSA is surveying those 30,000 households, that will come up, right? Then there's another category which is also important, which is called informal employment, right? These are people who are defined as working in precarious employment situations, right? And this has got nothing to do whether the business is registered or not, right? Because you may find, for example, people who are working in shops that have spread throughout the country over the years, owned by either kind of Chinese multinational, well, people of Chinese descent, or people coming from Pakistan, So, but even if those businesses are registered, by the way, so, but if your employment is regarded as precarious, by precarity here, we are referring, in other words, you are not entitled as an employee, nor do you receive any basic benefits, such as pension or medical aid contributions from your employer, right? And most importantly, you do not have a written contract of employment. Then that will be regarded as a category known as informal employment, right? So, and that last criteria is quite important. In other words, having a written contract of employment, because over the years there's been a sharp increase in number of entities, formal businesses. In other words, businesses. Some of them are big businesses, some of them are medium-sized businesses, but some are small businesses that meet the criteria of a registered business. In other words, they've been properly incorporated, they're registered with the, what is it called, CI, which falls under the Department of Trade and Industry, one of the entities there where companies get registered, and there are also, these businesses are registered for SARS, but then they employ people, right? And they just pay you a salary, and they make no contributions to your pension or medical aid. You sort yourself out of whatever they pay you, right? Some contract workers, in fact, most contract workers will fall under that category, right? But if you have a written contract of employment, then you become part of what is known as a formal employment sort of category. But if you don't have a written contract, and on top of that you don't kind of receive a pension or a medical aid contribution from your employer, then you will be regarded as an informal employment, right? And then that type of job, the informal employment, is regarded as precarious because, one, you don't have any protections. Secondly, obviously, you don't get any pension, there's no medical aid, and then also you don't have a kind of a formal or a written contract of employment. You just got hired on the basis of someone, oh yes, you can come and work here, 3 days a week or 4 days a week or whatever the number of days is. So that's regarded as informal employment. The trade unions and other kind of institutions kind of keep on trying to fight against that type of work, arguing that it's precarious, it offers no protection for workers, and the pay is generally or is mostly very low for those type of workers, and in the country's kind of legal system, they tend not to be to be offered any protection at all. So they're really at the mercy of their employers, right? And any questions thus far? Comments? Any of the stuff that I've described, is any of this reflected in your businesses?
Mr. Jabulani? Oh,
Yeah.
Mashile Palani can go ahead and then I'll follow after him. There's Mashile. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Sikhakhane. Look, the issue of the civil society, the role which civil society play in terms of job creation or something, obviously that is the volunteers most of the time, and then they don't have a formal, or sometimes they're informal sector or whatever. They are being regarded in the StatsSA as part of the employees or job creation. I mean, they're regarded as formal employees.
So for example, I mean, from the definition, if you do not have a formal, a written contract of employment, right, which is typically what happens if you are a volunteer, right, and obviously you don't get any pension or medical aid contribution from the entity that you volunteer for. Let me give you an example. I mean, when I finished high school in the early 80s, I worked in a trade union, in a trade union office. That's why I'm putting it in inverted commas, because one, I wasn't employed. I had no contract of employment, so I didn't qualify as an employee. I was just there to volunteer, but they would then give me transport money, right? Obviously, when I'm in the office Monday to Saturday, they will provide lunch, and there will be breakfast as well. I mean, when we come in the morning. So, but I wasn't getting paid. So I would have qualified as an informal kind of employee in that sense, in the statistical definition, because I had no contract, well, in fact, didn't even receive a pay, kind of a salary or a wage. They just kind of more type of volunteering kind of work. Does that help? Hello?
Yes, it's help, but
Yeah.
the question is that, you know, a lot of civil society nowadays, they don't have funding, presume to work. But even in the media, you can see, even in the media, small media companies, they just work, but they don't earn any income, or yeah, sometimes they never sign a contract because they don't even earn any income. So that means is that it's not regarded as that they're actually not regarded as but yeah, it shows that, but it's a lot of downsizing, a lot of issues.
Yeah, no, that's why I think it's important to understand what constitutes employment in terms of how StatsSA measures employment or unemployment, right? Because then when we're having these conversations or debates about employment, unemployment in South Africa, how to address it, we then need to understand, well, the statistics measure or give you a window, and that window has its limits. You know, you can take, like, I mean, if you take a window has a frame, right? So, and any statistical measure has got has got limits to it. So we need to understand what are those limits, and then what do they mean? Are there other things that fall outside of the framing or framework that's used to measure employment or unemployment, right? So if there are things that fall outside of that, well, what do we do about them, right? So historically, I mean, people would, employers, I mean, big employers, but also medium-sized employers do it too, where they go and take people who are coming out of school for a fixed period, like for a year. You don't get paid much. As I was using my example, trade union will have gave me a transport fare, so to and from home for me to come in, and then provided a meal during the day. But I wasn't getting a salary. So what did I get? You know, there were other benefits that come with that. One, the importance about work, particularly when you are young, is that it provides you with certain disciplines, right? The discipline that I need to wake up at 5 o'clock for me to be able to be at work at 8. That requires discipline, right? Now, if you don't work or don't go out, wake up in the morning, go and search for work, that discipline kind of falls away. And it's an important formative discipline, because, you know, if you hire someone, you want to know that they have that discipline to be able to wake up in the morning on time, and so that they're able to get to work on time, right? So even if you don't get paid in kind of like in your first year, and you can cover some of your, well, the person who hires you kind of informally can help you cover some of the expenses of getting to work, but you're getting other potential benefits. I call them potential because, you know, some people don't absorb that discipline of just waking up in the morning, getting to work on time. And then obviously there is the discipline throughout the day of doing various things. Some of them are repetitive. Some kind of pop up periodically. They don't have to be done on a day-to-day basis, but they kind of instill and build certain disciplines that become important if you're going to be a successful worker in the future, or even if you want to start your own business. But your point is valid. I mean, the issue of civil society institutions, NGOs, and other forms of institutions, whether be they a soccer association or any sporting body, a church, for example. You know, if you can get something that you get asked to do in a church, which will require you to wake up in the morning, go and do something, right? That sort of thing. That will, in my view, fall kind of broadly into that group of institutions that you're talking about. Right. Valent, you had a question?
Yes, no, thank you very much. I think, yeah, on my side, I'm just going to take you a step further, because, yeah, I think you've actually answered, yeah, some of the questions that I had. So I think in regards to national employment figures or volunteers, sometimes they do not necessarily reflect the true realities when it comes to rural or township communities. So I'm basing this, like, for example, in the previous, well, before COVID, you would have volunteers who'd come and knock and all of that. I remember back then. And then now you've mentioned survey. I think before my question, it's more or less regarding to in relation to surveys, right? Do they still do face to face? And pardon my ignorance, and I hope I'm not incorrect. Is it still face to face, or do they necessarily partner with, for example, Home Affairs, SARS, and then the education sector, where they can gauge the unemployment and employment stats there? That's more or less my question. And then the last one will be, how can we as publishers better highlight like local employment and unemployment dynamics using the available data?
Right. The actual detail of how StatsSA does the survey, obviously, as I said, they use a sample. In other words, in the case of the household survey, they've got about 30,000. They've got 30,000 households throughout the country, right? That they would talk to. Let me put it that way. Whether some of it will be a combination of face-to-face, some of it is a combination of telephonic, some of it is a combination of people filling kind of forms, in other words, a survey. So I don't know how many pages it is. Each then comes, in fact, if say, for example, if my household, right, were part of the 30,000, right? So the way then that they would do it, if I'm not there, let's say I'm traveling, I've gone to, I'm in Swaziland or I'm out of the country, right? They can use a proxy, in other words, somebody who is a member of my household. They can ask them the same questions that they will have asked me, right? So, which then some people point out that approach can create its own problems, right? Because there may be some distortions that arise through that. But every statistical kind of work usually accommodates kind of distortions, in other words, try and mitigates for any potential distortion. So that's that. On top of that, StatsSA, for example, can engage SARS and look at the SARS database. In other words, where SARS removes kind of people's names, because by law, SARS cannot hand over your kind of tax information to any other entity. Right? So there's that limitation. So, but you know, StatsSA, and for example, I mean, SARS does make its database without people's names and other sensitive details to economists. This is under very controlled circumstances. Economists who want to study what's happening in the labor market, or what's happening in the economy more broadly, right? So, so StatsSA theoretically can use some of that information, obviously under controlled conditions, to verify some of this stuff, right? By the way, when I talk about 30,000 households that StatsSA talks to, it doesn't mean that they divided equally among the 9 provinces, right? So, for example, Gauteng has the largest population in the country, followed by KwaZulu-Natal. In third place, I think, will be the Western Cape. So you would take that into account in constructing that 30,000 kind of list or sample. In other words, you need to weight accordingly. You can't just treat the Northern Cape has the smallest population, right, in the country, so that will be reflected in the composition, the geographic composition of that 30,000 kind of dwelling units. The other factor, obviously, is that Gauteng is the biggest economy kind of in the country, with accounting for about 35% of economic activity, followed by KZN at 16%, and the Western Cape at 14% of the overall economy. So that also has a huge bearing on the composition of those household units, because it also talks to employment opportunities and unemployment, by the way, because most people tend to migrate towards Gauteng because that's where your better economic opportunities are, or at least that's the thinking. And then when you arrive in Gauteng or Johannesburg, and find that it's actually not as rosy as it might seem from a distance. So what was the second part of your question?
No, I think that the last one is, after you said all of that, of which was very much helpful. Thanks for that. How can we as publishers better highlight local employment or unemployment dynamics using the available data?
Right. So StatsSA does provide a breakdown by provinces, and the actually detail also goes down to the level of the metros. So for example, you'll get numbers for Mahikeng, I think. If you are in the northwest, if you in Gauteng, it will provide you some detail about employment in Johannesburg, and so under Gauteng, it will tell you under the Johannesburg Metro or Egukhuleni or Tshwane kind of things. So there is that level of detail that you would get from those numbers down to that level. Unfortunately, I don't think it will. I'm subject to correction here because I've never looked really down to that level, whether it will say, if you take the Johannesburg Metro, whether it will then provide you with more granular detail, in other words, below the metro level or below the municipal level more broadly, right? So you can get data, say, for example, for Joburg or for Mahikeng, then you might then have to rely on, because sometimes universities and other institutions that do research do provide some broad detail. Like, for example, I mean, if you take Soweto as an example, people will construct a survey of people in Soweto, and then do some surveys about and come up with estimates of what the unemployment situation looks like, or employment situation looks like in Soweto. So you might get that if you want to go below the kind of city or the metro level or the municipal level, to look at the constituent parts of a municipality, to look at what the employment look like. So as I said, I mean, the unemployment data comes out every quarter or after every quarter. We've just had the first quarter. We had the first quarter of 2025. The data came out, I think, in May or early June. Then there's one other, I've forgotten now what its official title is, which is an annual review that StatsSA does of kind of employment or unemployment trends in the country, right? Which is an annual publication, which also has more detail and looks at trends, usually it will look over a 10-year period in terms of what has happened to employment. It would obviously then discuss those trends in detail. So some of those trends would be around, remember earlier in terms of the framing of employment stroke unemployment, I mentioned the fact that education stroke skills has a huge bearing on who gets a job and who doesn't, right? So that annual publication will obviously provide a lot more detail on that. It will also provide more detail on youth unemployment. And you would remember that in terms of who is a youth. Some of you who involved in politics will know that you can't be the president. Well, although people there have been some jokes about it, you can't be president of the ANC Youth League if you are over 35, because 35 is the cutoff period. Nor can you qualify for the NYDA assistance if you're over 35, because 35 is regarded, in terms of legislation in South Africa, is regarded as the cutoff point for the definition of youth, right? So then the way StatsSA would look at it is that it deems someone youth up until age 34, right? It's the same principle as retirement. If retirement is at 65, StatsSA goes up to age 64. So the same for youth, cutoff point is 35. So StatsSA data goes up to, in terms of youth, up to age 34. Right. And any other questions? Right. As I mentioned earlier, the issue of education and skills, so if I use them in one kind of broad category, because they are related. They're not one and the same thing, but they are related. So data will show that education, plays quite an important role in determining young people's employment prospects or their risk of unemployment. So, for example, data will show that those who've completed matric but did not proceed to go to university or for further training, mostly at a TVET college or any other form of training post-matric, have a relatively better chance of getting a job than those who didn't complete matric. The situation has actually got much more, has worsened if you take data for the last 10 to 15 years, that gap between, in other words, your chances of getting a job if you have not completed matric have worsened in the last 10 to 15 years, right? Secondly, there's a difference between those who've completed matric and those but didn't go to university versus those that did go for further training, in other words, went to a university or completed at a TVET college. So you'll find that the other way of looking at it is that unemployment for people who went to university or went to a TVET college is a lot lower than for those who completed matric but didn't proceed further with their education or training. It's even worse, obviously, for those who didn't complete matric, who dropped out of school. So education is a big factor. Even though also in the last, if you look at the data for the last 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years, unemployment has risen among university graduates. Obviously, it's worse for Black university graduates than it is for other race categories. And that's for obvious reasons. I mean, education in Black areas is kind of, if you go to a no-fee school, even if you do complete your matric, versus someone who went to a private school, complete matric, you both have matric, right? But if you come from a private school, and you're competing, or if you come from a no-fee school, high school, and you're competing with somebody who completed matric in a private school, you most likely to lose. You're not going to get the job, right? That's just the reality if you look at the data. So education is a big factor in terms of job opportunities or the risk of being unemployed, in fact, for an extended period of time. Then the other factor is obviously youth. If you are young, particularly if you've never worked before, your chances of getting a job are also quite at risk. The risk of not getting it is quite high if you are young. So hence, statistics will measure youth unemployment. So youth is measured in two categories, right? So it's 15 to 34, that's a broad category, but then there's also 15 to 24, right? And 15 to 24 is quite an important milestone, because that's roughly around when some people complete university education or further training, particularly if you do your basic degree and then you do postgraduate, depending what you're studying. So age 20, if you finished say at 18, completed matric at 18, and then you go to university at 19, 20, right? So that's about 6 years or so of post-matric education or training. Then that's an important kind of milestone for that reason, right? So of the category, if you take the broad category of 15 to 34 for young people or for youth, the 15 to 24 is most at risk, because that's people really who are most likely not to have actually held any job at all, as have had no previous work experience. Typically what happens, maybe by the time you are above 24, you might have done 6 months here of work, a year over here. You might have had an internship, which would contribute to your potential employability. You've got something that the employer can evaluate and say, oh, this person has worked or has held a job for 6 months to a year, in whatever category of job that may be. I mean, as I say, you could be have done an internship with a company, or an NGO, that sort of thing, right? So those two categories, youth, there's being young, your education levels are quite important in looking at employment. So coming back, Valent, to your point about how community media can cover unemployment. Another way of looking at it would be to look at education, right? So when the matric results come out, you can have a look at that. You can engage a university that's near you. So Northwest, in Mahikeng, the Mahikeng campus, if you are in the Northwest, might be a useful sort of engagement point around employment, unemployment opportunities, seen from kind of an education point of view. But also you may find that Northwest University, the economics department, might be doing research on employment and unemployment in the Northwest province. I don't know if they only focus nationally, but I suspect that they do look at what's happening at a provincial level. The other way of covering unemployment is to look at sectors. So, for example, agriculture, I would think, is a reasonably big sector in the Northwest province. So if you talk to the agricultural associations, these agricultural bodies, whether it's maize, it's one for maize farmers, I'm just making an example, they might be able to give you some insights into what's happening on employment in the province. So which then enables you to write about sort of employment, unemployment, whether that writing is linked directly to a StatsSA announcement, or this is something that you do separately from that, using data that comes out from an agricultural association or from the research that the university has done. That's the other way. The other ways of covering unemployment by way or employment is when, let's say, there's a building of a new shopping center, right? Because the construction part of the shopping center tends to create more jobs, but those are short-term jobs, because that's the construction has a fixed duration. You start, you have to complete the shopping center at a certain point. Then once it's complete, then the people who were employed for the construction phase obviously will lose their jobs unless the construction company finds another work where it's going to accommodate those employees. Then obviously the companies or the retail outlets that are going to operate, be based in the shopping center, have to hire people. So there's another category of employment that gets created through that. So you can kind of look at employment through those type of projects that you see happening in your neighborhood. If there's, as I say, building of a shopping center, or it could be the building of infrastructure. If your local municipality is building new roads or laying out new pipes for water, for sewage, or they're building a sewage treatment plant, all of those things typically do create jobs. So you can have a look at employment through those type of things and ask questions about, well, how many people are going to be employed, for how long, that sort of thing. Any other question?
So far, so good.
Yeah. So as I was saying, the StatsSA, when it comes to employment at a municipal level, they will often provide a breakdown between like, for example, the separate metros from other municipalities. As you know, the three broad categories of municipalities. You've got metros, which are your big cities: Joburg, Durban, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, Cape Town, Buffalo in the Eastern Cape, Gqeberha. Those are your metros, typically. And forgotten what the one that's centered in Bloemfontein, I think, or Mangaung. Yeah, Mangaung is a metro, and then they will kind of separate metros from the so-called non-metros, right? So you can get data that separates metros from the non-metros. Yeah. So that's that. What was the other point I wanted to make? Right. The other important difference between the survey of households, which is if you want to simplify it, it's the survey of individuals versus the survey of employers, is that with individuals, there's no double counting because you speak to one person about what the activities that they are involved in or they were involved in the previous week, right? So even if it's more than one activity, but because you're dealing with one individual, so that counts as one person, right? The problem, it's not a problem, but let me put it as a problem. The problem with surveying employers is that if you take the sample of 20,000 employers, right, there's a possibility of double counting with the employer survey. And this comes simply because some people work more than one job, right? So they will then feature under two employers, right? But because you are not asking or you are not looking at the individual employee names, you are just asking an employer how many people were you employing last week, and they say to 200, right? So that's employer A, and then you go to employer B, and employer B says 150. But when the reality is that out of the 150 employees, say in employer B, there may be 2 people who also feature under employer A, right? Because if you're doing kind of a job that doesn't pay much, you may actually end up taking 2 jobs. And sometimes this comes about because some people work 3 days a week for one employer, and then they go and work another 3 days a week for another employer. But they sit in the employment records of both employers, right? So which then means there's an element of double counting which you really can't eliminate. It's just the nature of how these things work. Any other questions, comments, issues that you see in your neighborhoods, or what's your sense? I mean, let's talk about what the Capitec guy, group CEO, was arguing, that in his view, based on what he sees through people who bank with Capitec, as well from his walkabouts in some of the black neighborhoods, he says he sees people, are hustling. They are hustling. They are out there. They're trying to sell something, and they make some money. And he says some people, on average, make upwards of 3,000 rand to 15,000 rand a month just by selling this or that. Is that a common occurrence in your neighborhoods? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Valent, can you break the ice? What do you see? What's your view? I mean,
sorry, please repeat the question.
No, my question was, what's your reading of what's happening in the neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, to be fairly specific, because this applied to the townships and informal settlements. The Capitec Group CEO was saying that in his view, there's a lot of activity that he sees people selling this or that, and from which they make some reasonable kind of sums of money on a monthly basis. I mean, do you notice much activity taking place?
If I'm being honest, right, it's what you actually just touched upon. So sometimes someone is selling, and then the next thing, nah, I've closed business, or I've moved elsewhere. So yeah, it's not something sustainable, but I do understand where he's coming from. So yeah, it's trying to figure out what's your next step. They don't stick to one particular thing, because today someone is selling fruits and veg, and then the following day you see them at the corner store or near the taxi rank, and then they're selling cigarette and all of that. So yeah, it differs. It differs. And then even when you're going to, I don't want to say the upper communities, but then more or less, when you're in the, like for example, I'm in Tembisa.
Yeah.
So you'd meet different kinds of people. And then, like you said, in a one household or family, you'd have someone selling fruit and veg, and then you'd have someone going through Joburg and all of that, selling sweets, selling this, saying, look, when you come back, we combine all of it. So yeah. And then obviously in terms of making money, like you said, today is 3,000, the following week is 5, the other week it's way, way less. And then, yeah, someday you just see them sitting, say, look, I've tried, so I wasn't making any break-even point. So it's been hard. So yeah, it's more or less that.
Yeah. Right. Well, it looks like that's it. I mean, unless there are other kind of, well, there are specific questions. Otherwise, I mean, we can kind of wrap it here, because going deeper into kind of the more technical kind of detail, I don't think will contribute much to.
I think maybe for if I can ask this question.
Right.
So in regards to, for example, reporting and then analyzing StatsSA data, can you provide in regards to those that are not, they don't, like, for example, with limited formal education, what ways or tools can you suggest to them? Because I don't think, some from like I said, from Tembisa, you'd have grown-ups, but then they're not well educated or well equipped in terms of reading those stats. Can you suggest anything else?
The StatsSA does provide kind of, for lack of a better word, let me say, kind of makes attempts to simplify so some of the data. Like, for example, whenever there's sort of the unemployment, let me hold on, let me just pull it up, and then I'll show you a link to it.
No problem.
It will be a useful thing to, that's. I'll put the link here in the chat.
No problem.
So that link, I mean, it was published at the same time. It's based actually on the quarterly labor force survey for the first quarter of 2025, but it focuses specifically on the young people in the labor market. And as I was, you remember I mentioned the fact that StatsSA does a 10-year look backwards. So this one, look, it's a decade in review, right? So it's a very simplified, because it's a narrative, right? Instead of just giving you the statistics as they are. So you can have a look at that narrative because it covers most of the territory that I've covered. For example, when it comes to young people, it is a section on a subheading on education, how qualifications still shape employment outcomes. It has a section that looks at the double burden of unemployment for young people, females. And then it also covers how uneven employment opportunities are between urban and non-urban areas. In other words, your small towns, small rural areas. If you are in a rural area or in a small town, you are at a gross disadvantage versus somebody who's sitting in Johannesburg, right, when it comes to unemployment. So every time StatsSA publishes the survey results, they would publish something like that. It's almost like a media release, but it's kind of, it has more detail and it's written in a narrative form. It highlights some of the key trends that the unemployment data shows. So you know, one can try and read through that. The second thing, as you would see also in that from that link that I've shared, is that what StatsSA does is that then it provides some graphics. So if you can look at a picture of something and make sense of it, because sometimes people who can't deal with words or numbers a lot, but if something is presented visually, they can kind of relate to it.
True, definitely.
Many years ago, I mean, I don't know if they still do it because I haven't seen anything in recent years, but I can ask StatsSA if they do. StatsSA was embarked some years ago on a project looking at translating some of this material into indigenous languages.
That will be interesting.
I suspect, though, that with all the cutbacks in funding for StatsSA, that's something that fell by the wayside. They even had a glossary in some of the major indigenous languages explaining some of the statistical terminology that they use in their publications.
Definitely. I think just a follow-up question on my side based on what you just said. Do you perhaps see any partnerships between StatsSA or academic institution partnering with community media to improve, I think, local story using all the data?
It's a worthwhile thing to approach StatsSA. I mean, I can give you maybe through Valent, send him the name of the person or persons in the comms department at StatsSA that you would need to engage with and say, look, because they're always looking for avenues to get this information out. So if you approach them, they could, I'm sure that's something that StatsSA would most welcome. Working with community media.
Definitely. Yeah, I think I'll speak to you on the side after our meeting, and then we may share the contact details. So I'd appreciate that.
I'll send you because the other thing that they do, I mean, but they often require you to give them advance notice of what you require. So StatsSA's comms department has a team that does graphics, right? So if you go through an announcement by StatsSA and you want them to develop a graphic for you that covers a piece of that announcement, I've found them willing to assist with that. Because if you're running a community media, it's a small scale operation relatively, and you may not have the resources to develop, a kind of graphics. But if you need one, so long as, you give them advance notice, it's not like, oh, sorry, I need it in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So they can do that, that kind of thing for you, and then email you the graphic, and then you can use it.
Okay. Okay.
Right. So yeah, thanks. I think that's it. If any questions crop up afterwards, you can email Valent, and then you can forward it to me. I can respond in writing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
No, I think so. I'll definitely do so. And then, yeah.
Right. Well, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Jabulani, and thank you very much to the members. And then Mr. Jabulani said, if you need any questions, you can definitely forward them to me, and then I'll definitely forward them to him. And then, we'll take it from there. And then, thank you very much for your time. And then,
Okay.
we'll definitely keep in touch.
Yeah.
Bye.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.